The thing I remember most is that he was smiling. Not my wife. My wife wasn't smiling. Nicole had her jaw set the way she did when she decided something and didn't want to be talked out of it, and she wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and her hand was steady when she held out the envelope, but there was a muscle jumping in her cheek that told me the steadiness cost her something. No. It was Richard who was smiling. He was standing about 4 feet behind her, in the doorway of my own office, one shoulder against the frame, hands in the pockets of a suit that cost more than my car. And he was smiling at me. Not a nervous smile. Not the smile of a man caught doing something. The smile of a man who has already won, who is enjoying the moment he's been looking forward to, who wants you to see that he's enjoying it. I was sitting at my desk. It was 10 in the morning on a Thursday. There were project files open in front of me, the Cattell Street development, a site inspection scheduled for that afternoon. Ordinary. The most ordinary Thursday of my life. Right up until my wife walked into my office at the company we both worked for and handed me divorce papers while my boss stood behind her and smiled. I opened the envelope. I don't know why. I already knew what it was. But I'm the kind of man who reads things before he reacts to them, and I read it. Petition for dissolution of marriage. And I set it down on the desk, and I looked at Nicole, and then I looked past her at Richard, and I said the only thing I said in that entire room. I said, okay. That's it. Okay. Richard's smile got a little wider because I think he'd wanted more. I think he'd wanted me to stand up, to shout, to make a scene he could shake his head at later, to give him the story where I was, the unstable one, and he was the calm hand that steadied Nicole through a difficult divorce from a difficult man. He'd staged it in my office, in front of the glass wall where half the floor could see, precisely because he wanted a scene. I didn't give him one. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest, because it's the whole key to how this went. In that moment, standing on the worst Thursday of my life, being handed the end of my marriage by my wife with my grinning boss as her witness, I was not thinking about revenge. I was thinking about a folder. A specific folder, on a specific drive, that I had been quietly building for almost 2 years, that neither of them knew existed, and that was about to matter more than anything else in any of our lives. But maybe it's better if I start further back, because to understand why I said okay, and why that folder existed, you have to understand what kind of man I am, and what kind of man they thought I was. Those turned out to be two very different things, and the gap between them is the entire story. My name is Marcus. I'm 41 years old. And for most of my life, I have been the reliable one. I don't say that with pride exactly, it's just accurate. I'm the man people describe as steady, dependable, good in a crisis. The one who reads the whole contract, who checks the numbers twice, who notices the thing that's off before anyone else does and quietly fixes it. I was that kid in school, not the brilliant one, not the popular one, the one the teacher trusted to run the thing while she stepped out. I was that man at work. I'm a project director. I run construction and development projects, the actual running of them, the thing that turns a rich man's drawing into a building that doesn't fall down. Schedules, crews, inspections, materials, the 10,000 small decisions a day that nobody sees and everybody depends on. It's not glamorous work. Nobody makes a movie about the guy who makes sure the rebar spec is right. But if I do my job badly, people can die, and I've never once forgotten that, and it made me careful in a way that turned out to matter. I'd worked at Hale Development for 9 years, Richard Hale's company. Richard was the face of it, the charming one, the deal maker, the man who could walk into a room of investors and walk out with their money. Tall, easy, expensive. People liked Richard. Richard was very good at being liked, and I was the man who made Richard's promises true. He'd sell a project on a timeline and a budget he'd invented on the spot to impress someone, and then he'd walk it back to my office and drop it on my desk and say, "Make it work, Marcus. You always make it work." And I always made it work. For 9 years, I made it work. I took the impossible things he promised and I ground them into real buildings through sheer, unglamorous competence, and Richard took the credit at the ribbon cuttings, and I stood at the back, and I told myself that was fine, because I wasn't in it for the credit. I had no equity. 9 years, and I never pushed for a piece of the company, because pushing wasn't my way, and because Richard had a way of making you feel that your loyalty was its own reward, that we were a team, that the money would come. It never came. I was very well paid to be the engine of a company I didn't own, and I told myself that was fine too. Nicole worked there as well. That's how we'd met, actually, 11 years earlier, before Hale, at a different firm. She ran the office and the books. She was sharp with money, sharp with people, ambitious in a way I found attractive because I wasn't. When Richard hired me at Hale, there was a finance position open, and I brought Nicole in, and Richard hired her too, and for a while the three of us were something like a good team. I got us the project I was proud of. Nicole kept the whole operations money clean and moving. Richard sold and smiled. We had 2 kids, Ella, who was 8 that year, and Jonah, who was 5. A house with a mortgage I was proud of paying. A life that, from the outside, looked like the reward for being the reliable one. I loved my wife. I need to say that plainly because everything that came after is only heavy if you know that it started from love. I loved Nicole. I wasn't a perfect husband. I worked too much. I brought the stress home in my shoulders. I was better at fixing problems than at talking about feelings. But I loved her, and I thought she loved me, and I thought the life we'd built was solid, the way I thought the buildings I built were solid, because I'd checked it, because I was careful. I hadn't checked carefully enough. The first thing I noticed wasn't the affair. I want to be honest about that, because people always assume the husband either knows everything or knows nothing, and it's never that clean. The first thing I noticed was the numbers. It was about 2 years before the Thursday. A subcontractor I'd worked with for years, a good man named Dell who poured foundations, called me one evening off the books, uncomfortable, and asked me why Hale had stopped using his crews. I didn't know we had. On the Riverside project, he said, they'd gone with a company he never heard of, out of state, that had underbid him by a margin that didn't make sense. That price isn't real, Marcus, Dell told me. Nobody pours for that. Somebody's cutting something. I looked into it, quietly, the way I look into everything. And the price wasn't real. The out-of-state company barely existed. A shell, a name, an address that was a mailbox. But the invoices Hale was paying to it were very real and very large, and the concrete that actually got poured on Riverside was a cheaper mix than the one the client was being billed for. Somebody was billing the client for premium and pouring economy and pocketing the difference through a company that didn't exist. I told myself at first that it was a mistake, a supplier mix-up. I'm the reliable one. My instinct is to assume error before malice. But I'm also careful, and careful men keep records while they figure out whether it's error or malice. So I started a folder, just documentation, the invoices, the real specs versus the build specs, the core samples I quietly pulled, dates, names, and the more I documented, the less it looked like a mistake. It looked like a system, and a system has an architect, and there was only one person at Hale with the authority and the access to build something like that, only one person who signed off on the vendor accounts and moved that kind of money, Richard. But Richard couldn't have done it alone. Moving money like that, hiding it in the books, making a shell company's invoices look clean in the accounting, that took someone in finance, someone who ran the books, someone who knew exactly how to make numbers say what you needed them to say. I didn't let myself finish that thought, not for a long time. Because the person who ran the books was my wife, and I loved my wife, and I was the reliable one, the careful one, the one who checked twice, and there are some things that a man, even a careful man, especially a careful man, does not want to check twice. So I kept building the folder about Richard, and I kept the part about the books in a separate drawer of my mind, locked, and I did not open it. That was my one failure of nerve. I want to name it, because I've thought about it a great deal since. For a whole year, I documented a fraud and refused to see who else it implicated, because seeing it would have meant seeing my marriage, and I wasn't ready. The reliable one has a blind spot, and the blind spot is always the thing he can't bear to be reliable about. There were other signs. The signs there always are, that you explain away. Nicole was distant, but we were both busy. She worked late, but so did I. She and Richard had a rapport, an ease, private jokes at company dinners, but they'd worked side by side for years, and Richard had a rapport with everyone. That was his whole talent. When she started dressing differently, I told myself she wanted to. When she stopped reaching for me at night, I told myself we were tired. When Richard began, over that last year, to treat me with a new kind of dismissiveness, a coolness under the charm, a way of talking over me in meetings he never used to, I told myself he was under pressure. I explained it all away, because explaining things away is what you do when the truth would cost you a life you love. I know something about that now. What I didn't know that whole last year was that they knew about the folder, or feared it. Because here is what I understand now looking back, that I couldn't see then. Richard didn't turn on me because he'd fallen for my wife. Or, not only. Richard turned on me because I was the one man in the company who could see the numbers. I was the project director. I pulled the core samples. I knew the real specs. I was, without either of us saying it, the single greatest threat to the thing he was doing. and he'd been sleeping with the woman who ran his books, and at some point, in some bed I paid the mortgage on, the two of them had done the math on me. They needed me gone. Not just out of the marriage, out of the company. Away from the projects, away from the samples, away from the paper. Discredited, if possible, a bitter ex-husband, an unstable man, someone whose word would mean nothing if he ever started making accusations. The divorce papers at the office weren't just cruelty. I thought they were, at first. Standing there on that Thursday, I thought Richard was just savoring it. But he was doing something colder than savoring. He was starting the story. The story where I was the wronged, angry, unreliable ex-husband, so that when I opened my mouth about anything, the money, the concrete, any of it, everyone would already know I was just bitter. He humiliated me in public because a humiliated man's accusations are easy to dismiss. He was smart. I'll give him that. It was a smart plan. It had one flaw, and the flaw was the same flaw every plan against me ever had. They thought I was only reliable. They thought reliable meant harmless. They'd spent years watching me absorb whatever they handed me and quietly make it work, and they mistook the quiet for weakness, and the steadiness for a man who would always just say okay and take it. They forgot that a man who checks everything twice, who keeps every record, who notices the thing that's off before anyone else, that man is not harmless, that man is just patient. And on that Thursday, when I said okay and set the papers down and looked at Richard smiling in my doorway, I wasn't surrendering. I was starting to check the numbers one last time. Before we go on, if this story is pulling you in, take a second to subscribe. It's the only way to know when the next one goes up. And if someone ever mistook your patience for weakness, tell me in the comments. I read them. Now let me tell you what happened next. I found out about the affair 6 weeks before the papers, not dramatically. There was no lipstick, no text left open on a screen, none of the things that happen in the versions of this story people tell at bars. I found out the way I find out everything, through a document. I was reconciling expense reports. It was a Sunday night, and I'd brought work home the way I always did, and I was going through the company card statements for a quarterly review Richard had asked me to help with, which, in hindsight, was its own kind of arrogance, handing the reliable man the very statements that would end you. There was a hotel charge. A nice hotel, downtown, 40 minutes from our office, on a Tuesday afternoon in a month when there was no reason for anyone from Hale to be at a downtown hotel on a Tuesday afternoon. It was on Richard's card. That wasn't strange in itself. Richard charged everything. But I'm the reliable one, so I cross-referenced it, the way I cross-reference everything. And I checked the calendar, and that Tuesday, Nicole had told me she had a dentist appointment and would be out of the office for a few hours in the afternoon. I sat with that for a moment, just a moment. And then I did the thing I'd refused to do for a year. I opened the locked drawer in my mind. And once it was open, I couldn't close it again. Because the mind is a terrible, thorough thing once you let it work, and mine is more thorough than most. I went back through 2 years of Tuesdays. I went back through the late nights that didn't match the workload. I went back through the ease between them at the dinners, the private jokes, the way she'd started defending Richard's decisions to me at home before I'd even criticized them. I laid it all out the way I'd lay out a project timeline, and it fit. Every piece of it fit. My wife was having an affair with my boss, and she had been, I could see now, tracing the pattern backward for the better part of 2 years, which meant it had started right around the time the money started going to a company that didn't exist. That was the moment the whole thing became one thing, because I'd been carrying 2 separate weights, you understand. In one hand, the fraud, Richard's fraud, a professional betrayal, a thing I could take to the authorities with a clear conscience. In the other hand, a marriage I felt going quietly cold, a thing I kept telling myself I could still save with more attention, more time, more of the reliability that had always been my answer to everything. And on that Sunday night, the 2 weights became one, and it was heavier than both because I finally understood that they weren't 2 things. They were one thing. The affair and the fraud had the same start date. They'd grown together. My wife hadn't drifted toward Richard, and separately my boss had happened to be a criminal. My wife had run the books that hid Richard's crime, and somewhere in the running of those books, in the shared secret of the money, in the intimacy of 2 people keeping a dangerous thing hidden together, she had become his. I don't know which came first, the bed or the books. I've never known, and I've stopped needing to. But they were the same betrayal, and my wife was not a bystander to the thing Richard was doing to the company and the clients and, God help me, to the people who would one day live and work in buildings poured with concrete that wasn't what it was built to be. My wife was the one who made the numbers lie. I have to tell you what that Sunday night was like, because it's the hinge of everything, and because if I skip over it, you'll think I'm harder than I am. I went out to the garage so I wouldn't wake the kids, and I sat on the cold concrete floor with my back against the workbench, and for a long time I didn't do anything at all. I'm not a man who cries easily. I didn't that night either, not really. What I did was something worse and quieter. I grieved with my whole body, silently, the way you grieve when the thing that died is not a person but a version of your entire life. 11 years, 2 children, a house I'd painted every room of, a woman I'd have said, that morning I trusted more than anyone alive. And the cruelest part, the part I keep coming back to, is that even then, on that garage floor, the reliable man was still working. Even in the middle of the worst grief of my life, some part of my mind was quietly, coldly, organizing. Because that's who I am. I couldn't turn it off. While one part of me was breaking, another part was already thinking, don't confront her, don't tip them, don't do the thing they'd expect a betrayed husband to do, keep building the folder, check everything twice. I've wondered since whether that made me cold. Whether a warmer man would have thrown open the door and had it out that night. Maybe, but I've come to think it was the opposite of cold. It was the only way I had to protect the 2 people in that house who hadn't betrayed anyone. Ella and Jonah were asleep upstairs, and whatever happened next was going to land on them, and I was not going to let it land badly because their father lost control on a garage floor. The steadiness that had made me a mark my whole life was, in the end, the only thing I had to protect my kids with. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than the reversal, harder than the ending. For 6 weeks, I lived in that house and worked at that company and said nothing. I ate dinners across from a woman I knew was betraying me, and I asked her about her day. I sat in meetings with a man I knew was a criminal, and I said, make it work? I'll make it work. I helped Nicole with the kids' bedtime and read Jonah his dinosaur book and did not let one crack show. And every night after the house was asleep, I went to the garage or the spare room, and I opened the folder and I made it complete, because I'd realized something. The fraud folder I'd built was strong on Richard, but if I was gonna do this, really do this, I needed it to be undeniable. I needed it to be the kind of thing that couldn't be waved away as a bitter ex-husband's revenge fantasy. It had to be so clean, so documented, so verifiable by strangers that it would stand up no matter what story they told about me afterward. So I built it like I build everything. Carefully. I pulled the core samples from 3 projects and had them tested at an independent lab, paid for out of my own pocket, in my own name, with a documented chain of custody so no one could ever say I'd tampered with them. The results confirmed it. The concrete in the ground was not the concrete on the invoices. On one project, a mixed-use building where people would live, the structural mix was below code. Below code. That word kept me up more than the affair did, because the affair was a wound to me. That was a danger to strangers. I gathered the invoices from the shell company and traced its ownership as far as I could, which was far enough to show it led back to accounts Richard controlled. I saved every email where Richard had directed me to sign off on specs I'd flagged, and every email where I'd flagged them. Because that mattered too, that I'd objected, in writing, and been overruled. That was my own protection. I had refused, on paper, to be part of it. I wasn't a co-conspirator having a change of heart. I was the one man in the building who'd said no and been ignored. And then there was the part I didn't want to build, the books, Nicole's books, the accounting entries that turned the shell company's fake invoices into clean-looking expenses, the reconciliations that shouldn't have reconciled and did anyway because someone skilled had made them. Her fingerprints, not literal, but the digital kind, the login records, the entry timestamps, the adjustments made under her credentials, were all over the machinery that hid the money. I built that part of the folder too. I made myself do it. Sitting in the spare room at 2 in the morning documenting my own wife's role in a crime was the loneliest work I have ever done. Every entry I saved was another piece of proof that the woman I'd loved for 11 years was not a woman who'd fallen out of love with me. She was a woman who'd chosen, clear-eyed over years, to commit fraud with the man she was sleeping with and to end our marriage by ambush the moment the 2 of them decided I was a liability instead of a husband. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make Nicole a monster, and I've tried hard, in the years since, not to. I don't fully know how she got there. I know Richard is the kind of man who makes wrong things feel like smart things, who makes you feel chosen, who dangles a bigger life. I know Nicole was ambitious in a way I never fed, that she wanted more than my steadiness could give her, and that Richard offered more. I know people don't wake up one day and become someone else. They get there one small compromise at a time, one Tuesday at a time, until the person they've become would be unrecognizable to the person they were. I think that's what happened to her. I think she compromised her way into a stranger, and by the time she handed me those papers, the woman I'd married wasn't really in the room anymore. That's the most generous thing I can say. It's also, I think, the truest. But it didn't change what I had to do. Understanding how someone became dangerous is not the same as pretending they aren't. I finished the folder about a week before the Thursday. I didn't know then that the Thursday was coming. I was still working out my own timing, still deciding how and when and to whom. I had a lawyer's name written down. I'd started, carefully, to research who the right regulator was, which agency handled the kind of fraud and the kind of building code violation I was sitting on. I was moving deliberately, the way I move on everything, and I thought I had time. They moved first. That's the one thing they did that I didn't see coming. I'd assumed I was still invisible, still the harmless, reliable man absorbing whatever came. But I'd been distracted for 6 weeks holding my face together at dinner, and I'd missed the signs that they were about to strike. That Richard had decided the time had come to get me out before I could become a problem, and that Nicole had agreed to be the instrument of it, because a wife serving papers at the office was the cleanest, most humiliating, most discrediting way to start the story of Marcus the bitter ex. So the Thursday came before my Thursday could. Nicole walked into my office with the envelope, and Richard smiled behind her, and they thought they were ending it. They were starting it. Because I want you to understand the exact shape of what happened in that room, now that you know what I was carrying. When my wife handed me those papers and my boss smiled, I was not a blindsided man. I was a man who had been documenting both of their crimes for 2 years, who had an independently tested, lab-verified chain of custody folder sitting on an encrypted drive, who had a lawyer's name in his pocket and had already started figuring out which door to knock on. They thought they were catching me off guard. I had been ready for 6 weeks. That's why I said okay, not because I was broken, because there was nothing to argue about in that room. Everything real was already handled, in a folder they didn't know existed, and the worst thing I could have done, the thing Richard wanted, the thing that would have started their story instead of mine, was to react. So I read the papers, and I set them down, and I said okay, and I watched Richard's smile flicker just slightly, because a man who's expecting an explosion is unsettled by a man who simply nods. I packed the box that afternoon. They let me. Of course they let me. They wanted me gone that day before I could think, before I could copy anything, not knowing I'd copied everything a year ago. I took my personal things and my framed photo of Ella and Jonah, and I left the building where I'd spent 9 years making Richard's promises true, and I drove home to a house that was still, on paper, half mine, and I sat in the driveway for a while. And I made the last decision, the one that turned out to be the hardest of all of them. Not whether to use the folder, that was never in question, not with people who might live in that building. The question was how. Because the folder didn't just take down Richard, it took down Nicole too. Everything that proved Richard's fraud also proved my wife's role in hiding it. I could not expose him without exposing her. The same documents did both. And Nicole was not just my betrayer, she was Ella's mother, she was Jonah's mother, and whatever I did next, they were going to grow up in the world it made. I sat in that driveway and I understood that I was holding 2 things that could not both be true. I could have the clean, total, righteous destruction of the 2 people who had betrayed me, the full satisfaction of it, both of them, everything they deserved. Or I could protect my children from growing up as the kids whose fathers sent their mother to prison. I could not have both. And I had a folder in my pocket and 2 kids in that house, and a smile I couldn't stop seeing every time I closed my eyes, and I had to decide what kind of man I was going to be on the other side of this. Not the kind of man they thought I was, and not even, it turned out, the kind of man I thought I was. I sat in the driveway until it got dark. And then I went inside, and I started to figure out the one path through this that was narrow enough and precise enough and hard enough to do the thing that had to be done and still leave my children a mother. It was going to cost me the clean version. The satisfying version. The version where I got to watch both of them get everything they had coming. I was going to have to be bigger than I wanted to be, and I did not want to be. God, I did not want to be. But Ella was 8, and Jonah was 5, and they hadn't done anything to anyone. The narrow path took me 3 weeks to find, and it came down to a single question I had to answer honestly before anything else. What was the thing that actually had to happen? Not what did I want, What had to happen? And when I stripped away the wanting, and there was a great deal of wanting, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There were nights I lay awake constructing the version where both of them lost everything, and I watched. When I stripped that away, what was left was small and clear. The buildings had to be made safe. That was non-negotiable. There were people who would live and work in structures poured below code, and no amount of family complication changed that. And Richard had to be stopped. Not punished necessarily, though I wanted that. Stopped. Because a man who does this once does it again, on the next project, and the next set of strangers who move into the next building don't get a project director who kept a folder. Everything else, my satisfaction, my vindication, the pleasure of watching two people get what they had coming, was want, not need. And I had 2 kids who were going to grow up in whatever world I built with this thing in my hands. So I built the smallest world that still contained justice. I hired the lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer. I hired one of those too, eventually, but that's a footnote. I hired a lawyer who knew whistleblower work, and I sat in her office with my drive and my lab results and my 2 years of documentation, and I told her the whole thing, including the part about my wife, including the part about my children, and I asked her a question I'd been shaping for 3 weeks. If I bring this, I said, can it be structured so that the person who architected it takes the weight, and the person who was recruited into it has a path that isn't prison? She was quiet for a while. Then she said, that's not up to you. You need to understand that first. Once this goes in, it goes where it goes, and you don't control it. I know, but, she said, how you present it matters. Who you frame as the principal matters. Whether someone cooperates early matters a great deal. And prosecutors have discretion about people who come in voluntarily with information before they're caught. That was the whole path, right there in that sentence. I couldn't decide Nicole's fate, but I could decide the order of things, and the order of things was everything. So this is what I did, and it's the part I've thought about more than any other, because it required me to sit in a room with the woman who had ambushed me in my own office and offer her something. I went to see Nicole. Alone. In a coffee shop, in the afternoon, neutral ground, 3 weeks after she'd handed me the papers. She came in braced. I could see it. She'd expected this meeting for weeks and had built her armor for it. The wronged woman armor, the it's not what you think armor, or maybe the cold, transactional armor of a person who'd already moved on and just wanted the logistics handled. I don't know what she planned. It didn't survive the first 2 minutes. I put a folder on the table. A paper one, thin, a fraction of what I had. Enough. Don't open it here, I said. Open it tonight, alone. It's the Riverside invoices, the lab results on the core samples, and the reconciliation entries from March through August of last year. The ones made under your login. I have never seen a person's face do what my wife's face did in that coffee shop. All the armor came off at once, not slowly, like a wall coming down, but like a wall being removed. Underneath was pure animal fear. Marcus, I'm not blackmailing you, I said. I want to be very clear, because it's going to feel like that for a minute. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking you to leave him. There's nothing you can give me that I want. This isn't a negotiation. Then what is it? It's a warning I'm not required to give you. I remember how steady my own voice was, and how strange that was, sitting across from her. In 8 days, my lawyer files everything with the regulator and the district attorney's office. Everything. The concrete, the shell company, the invoices, and yes, the books. I'm not going to sit on a building that's below code so that this stays a family matter. People live in those, so it's going in. That's decided, and nothing you say in the next 10 minutes changes it. She had started to cry. Silently, hands flat on the table. But I'm giving you 8 days, I said, because there's a difference, apparently, between someone who gets caught and someone who walks in on their own with information before anyone comes looking. My lawyer can give you a name. If you go in first, voluntarily, and you tell them the whole truth about who built the scheme and how, and you cooperate, you're a witness. If you wait until this lands and they come for you, you're a defendant. Why? She said. It wasn't really a question. It came out cracked. After what Marcus, why would you? Because Ella's 8, I said, and Jonah's 5. That was all I said. It was the entire reason, and there was nothing to add to it. I want to tell you that giving her that was noble, and that I felt good about it. I didn't. I felt sick. Everything in me was screaming that she deserved to be caught flat-footed, that she'd earned the version where she found out from a knock at the door, that I was handing mercy to a woman who had ambushed me in my own office with our boss grinning behind her. 8 days. I gave her 8 days I wasn't obligated to give, and every one of them tasted like swallowing glass. But I kept seeing the same picture. My daughter at 25 telling someone the story of her family, and the story being my father sent my mother to prison. Or my son at 15 doing the arithmetic on who did what to whom and landing on his father as the one who'd made the choice. I couldn't do that to them for the sake of my own satisfaction. That's the whole of it. I have never been able to explain it better than that. She went in on day 6. I didn't know until my lawyer told me. Nicole walked into the district attorney's office with her own attorney and she told them everything. The shell company, the invoices, the mix, Richard's directives, the years of it, and she gave them the one thing my documentation couldn't give them on its own. She gave them intent. She could testify to conversations. She could put Richard's decisions in his own mouth. My folder proved that a fraud existed. My wife proved who built it. That was the difference between a long civil mess and an indictment. Richard never saw it coming. That's the part I allow myself, the small pleasure I don't apologize for. Because Richard's entire genius was reading people, and he'd read me as harmless and read Nicole as his, and he was wrong about both, and he had no idea, for 3 more weeks, that the floor was already gone beneath him. He found out in public. I want to be honest, I did not orchestrate that. People assume I did when I tell this, and it would make a better story. But the truth is that these things move on their own schedule, and the schedule happened to be cruel to him in a way I couldn't have designed. Hale Development had a thing every autumn, an investor evening at a hotel downtown, a couple hundred people, drinks, and a presentation, and Richard on a small stage being charming about the year ahead. Clients, investors, city people, the contractors, everyone. It was the room he lived for. 9 years I'd stood at the back of that room while he took credit for buildings I'd built. They came for him that night. Not dramatically, nobody kicked in a door. 2 people from the regulator's office and, I'm told, someone from the DA's investigator's office came in during the drinks portion, quietly, and spoke to him at the edge of the room. There was no scene. There didn't have to be. In a room of 200 people who know exactly what regulators look like, a man being walked into a side room during his own investor evening is a scene without anyone raising their voice. He never gave the presentation. The room worked out what it was watching in about 10 minutes, the way rooms do. By the time the news went out properly, half the people in that hotel had already made their calls. I wasn't there. I want to say that plainly, because it matters to how this ended for me. I was invited, technically, my name was still on an old list, and for about a day I considered going. I thought about standing at the back of that room one more time, the way I had for 9 years, and watching him understand. I didn't go, not because I was above it, because I had Ella and Jonah that weekend, and it was Jonah's first soccer game, and I made a choice about which room I wanted to be standing in. That's the closest thing to a triumph I have in this whole story, and it doesn't look like one. I was on the sideline of a 5-year-old soccer game in the cold, holding a thermos, when my phone started going off with messages from people at that hotel. I read 3 of them. Then I put the phone in my pocket, and I watched my son run in the wrong direction with tremendous enthusiasm, and I cheered. Richard's case took 2 years. I won't drag you through it. There were charges around the fraud and the falsified compliance documents. There was a settlement with the clients on 2 projects. The below-code building was remediated. That was the thing I checked on most over those 2 years, the only outcome I ever really needed. It cost a fortune and it got done, and there are people living in that building right now who have no idea that any of this happened, and that's exactly as it should be. That's what the job is. Nobody makes a movie about the man who makes sure the rebar spec is right. Richard did not end up destroyed in the way I sometimes imagined on the bad nights. Men like Richard rarely do, completely. He lost the company, the license, the standing, the room. He is not, as far as I know, in a position to build anything again. That will have to be enough, and most days it is. Nicole was not charged. Her cooperation held. She lost her professional credentials, and she will never work in accounting again, and she carries what she did, which is its own sentence and, I think, a longer one than people imagine. We are divorced. It went through quietly in the end, without much fight, because there wasn't much left to fight about. We co-parent. That's the word people use. It's a strange, formal, functional thing. Schedules and handovers and school events where we stand 10 feet apart and are polite. Ella is 11 now. Jonah is 8. They are, as far as I can tell, all right. They have a mother and a father who both show up, who don't speak badly about each other in front of them, who have made the machinery of their childhood work despite everything. They don't know the details. Someday they will. You can't keep something like this buried forever, and I won't lie to them when they're old enough to ask. But they'll get it at an age where they can hold it, and they'll get it without their father having built a monument to his own grievance for them to live inside. Nicole thanked me once, about a year after. We were doing a handover in a parking lot, and the kids were in the car, and she stood there for a second and said, "I know what those 8 days were." And I said, "They weren't for you." And she said, "I know that too." And that was the whole conversation, and it was, in its way, the truest one we'd had in years. I'm not going to tell you I'm at peace with her. I don't know that I ever will be. There is a particular loneliness in having done the decent thing for someone who did the indecent thing to you, and no one ever tells you that decency doesn't come with a feeling of triumph. It mostly comes with a quiet, permanent tiredness. Here's what I lost. I want to count it honestly, because this is where these stories usually cheat. I lost 11 years of a marriage I thought was real, and worse, I lost the memory of it. Because now when I look back at the good years, I can't stop wondering which ones were already rotten underneath, and that contaminates things that used to be mine. I lost 9 years of work. The buildings are still standing, and I'm proud of them, but the company I helped build is gone, and the career I'd spent a decade constructing had to be started over at 41, in an industry where everyone had heard my name attached to a scandal, even when they knew I was the one who reported it. It took 2 years to get back to steady, and I lost the clean version. I want you to understand that this is a real loss. I never got the scene. I never got to stand in that hotel and watch him understand. I never got the moment of confronting my wife with everything I knew and watching her fall apart in front of me. I never got to hand it all to them and say, "Look what you did. Look who I actually was." Every satisfying version of this story I gave away, on purpose, in a coffee shop in a driveway, in exchange for 2 kids getting to keep a mother. That trade was right. I'd make it again. But it was a trade, and I paid it, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it felt good. Here's what I got. I got my son's soccer game. I got to be the man who was standing on that sideline instead of standing in that hotel. I got 2 children who are going to grow up without a war, which is not nothing, which is in fact the whole thing. And I got the folder, not the documents. Those are gone into a court file somewhere. I mean what the folder was. Because at some point in those 2 years, I understood what I'd actually been doing all along. From the first invoice in that first month, before I knew about any of it, I had been being careful. That's all. That's the whole superpower. I'm not clever. I never outmaneuvered anyone. I have no talent for strategy, and I'd have lost any confrontation Richard picked with me. All I ever did my entire life was check things twice and keep the records and notice when something was off and write it down. They saw that and they called it harmless. My wife saw a man who was predictable. My boss saw a man who could be handed impossible things and would quietly make them work and never make a fuss. They looked at 9 years of steadiness and read it as a man with no edges. Nobody ever thinks the careful man is dangerous. That's the mistake. Careful is not the opposite of dangerous. Careful is just dangerous that hasn't been given a reason yet. I've told you all of this, and I want to say the last part plainly, because it's the only thing I actually came here to say. If you're the reliable one, the steady one, the one who gets handed the impossible thing and quietly makes it work, the one nobody worries about because you never make a fuss, then someone in your life has probably mistaken that for weakness. They've mistaken your patience for passivity. They've decided that because you don't make noise, you don't notice. You notice. You've always noticed. You're the one in the room who sees the thing that's off, who remembers the date, who keeps the receipt, who knows the number doesn't add up even when everyone else has moved on. That's not a small thing, and it never was. You don't have to become someone else to be taken seriously. You don't have to get loud. The steadiness they underestimated is not the thing you need to overcome, it's the thing you have. The last time I saw Richard Hale in person was in that doorway, with his hands in his pockets, smiling at me while my wife handed me the end of my marriage. I've thought about that smile for years now, what it meant, what he thought he was doing. He was smiling because he'd looked at me for 9 years and decided he knew exactly what I was. He was right, actually. That's the part I've come to appreciate. He knew exactly what I was. He just never once thought about what that made me capable of. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the ones still coming. And tell me, what would you like the next story to be about? I'll be reading you in the comments.